I like the picture in the background there, Matt. The poisoning of me,
Death of
poisoning of
Socrates.
Socrates. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. Hemlock. Yeah.
yeah. It's that picture's been above me in my old office, and I've just moved, and now everyone else gets to see it. Ashton, do you see Everett in the waiting room, or is everybody
No, not yet.
okay? Well, Everett was going to possibly introduce, but because he's not here yet, I'll go ahead and start doing that myself. Let me share a couple of slides here. All right. So Steiner's leading us into the importance, deeper into the importance of spiritual exercises, and really emphasizing the extent to which there are certain qualities of soul that we have to cultivate in order to prepare and purify our astral bodies for the birth of this new self within us.
Hey, Matt, the
Yeah.
full slide, I don't know if you what it looks like. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. To prepare for the birth of this new self, we have to practice these exercises to strengthen our will, our thinking, and our feeling. And Steiner lists five of these sort of requirements, that we must become the director of our own living thinking, that we must become at one with the life of our willing. And what he says mastering the will, and we, in a sense, he says, have to come to obey ourselves and not be driven by, bodily cravings, metabolic needs. I mean, of course, we need to eat. We have certain needs that need to be satisfied. And he's not saying that we should be ascetic, but we have to be freely choosing, and instead of being compelled by these bodily kind of metabolic activities. And he wants us to cultivate, yeah, and at oneness with our will, so that we can avoid this deplorable state of mind, as Adams translates it, which occurs when we allow our wishes and desires to stir up our willing toward ideas that we have no real expectation of being able to fulfill. So in other words, we're wanting impossible things, and getting lost in this fantasy wish fulfillment with our will, instead of and one of the exercises he suggests is to just every day at a certain time remember to perform a certain simple task, and we gradually strengthen our will, and we come to be confident in our ability to control what we do. And it's not that, Steiner, he quotes Goethe a few times, saying crave the impossible and live into the idea. And, Steiner says this is still true, but we need to be able to accomplish what's possible with our willing before we can crave the impossible, and live in the ideas. Similarly, Steiner counsels us to become balanced in our feeling life. He specifically says that while we can and will continue to feel even more deeply as we develop spiritually, that these emotions that we feel inwardly, we should find ways to yeah, have control over how we express ourselves, right? And so it's not so much the feeling we have to restrain, but the expression of the feeling, the outward expression of emotion that he wants us to gain more capacity to regulate. And then he says we must develop a positive attitude toward life. And here he mentions this story. I forget which gospel it is, where Jesus sees a dead dog, and instead of dwelling on decaying, ugly corpse, Jesus notices the beautiful teeth. And, Steiner suggests here that we come to view truth, beauty, and goodness in all things, that these ideals, the beautiful, the good, the true, really cannot fail of exemplification, even in things that might appear initially ugly, that there's always a more positive attitude we could take to draw out some truth, some beauty, or some goodness from that phenomenon. And then Steiner says that we should remain open and receptive to novel life experiences, like learn from the past, but never be so stuck in our habitual understanding that we're incapable of encountering something new that surprises us, that requires us to grow, to expand our understanding. And then there's a sort of sixth quality of soul that allows us to harmonize the five that I've mentioned, right? Mastering our thinking, mastering our willing, mastering our feeling, developing this positive attitude, and remaining receptive and open to novel experience. And then we have to find a way to balance all of these as well. I mentioned one of the exercises, just reminding us ourselves every day to perform a simple task. Steiner also introduces the nightly review exercise, where before we go to bed, we review it backwards, the events which occurred during that day. And this is, in some sense, a preparation for dying, where this same kind of life review will happen. But I kind of picture this as it's part of this initiatory process whereby the soul, by remembering its day backwards, is gradually unwinding itself from the spirals of time, right? And coming to see this moving image as the presence of eternity, right? And we need to gradually remind ourselves to awaken to that fact, because we're so twisted up in time, we forget, right? And the process of being born into a physical body is this twisting. I'm thinking of the revolution of the planets and the rotation of the Earth, and the way that this just like twists us up into time, and it's very easy to get confused. And this exercise of the nightly review is an attempt to unwind this confusion for us. Let me go to my next slide here. So, occult science, this chapter 5 in particular, is a kind of how-to guide to prepare the soul for its recollection of eternity. And we will confront eternity one way or another when we die, and that could be a rude awakening, or if we're prepared for it, quite a sublime experience. Right. And so the point here is not whether or not the soul will recollect eternity. It's, can we do this while we're still alive in a physical body? And so when we begin this process of awakening, Steiner says we will encounter these blemishes of our physical double. We'll be confronted with that. And it's just then, when we're confronted with our own personal failings, that we have to turn our attention away from our private fears and fortunes toward the plight of others, and that we come to share that plight as our own. So Steiner says we ought to refrain from thought of our own personal affairs and rise to the contemplation of the concerns of mankind at large. And so this is a kind of kenosis, or self-emptying, that Steiner is counseling here. We must, after this new self has been born and these new imaginative capacities start to flower, we then have to annihilate them, in a sense, right? Become as nothing, and not get so conceited in our newfound powers, but silence the arbitrary aspect of our will, so that we can make room for, Steiner says, it to think in me, or really he's speaking of the Christ to think in me. So it's about letting logos take root and blossom in our souls. And then Steiner emphasizes, despite the importance of mastering the will and the feelings, there's something significant about thinking, that in our thinking activity, we're in a sense already participating in the spiritual world. And thinking for Steiner is like it's the safe and sure road, he says. And it plays this intermediating function, allowing us to pass from natural science to spiritual science. And so all along the way here, Steiner has been emphasizing that, until our logical judgments are sound and until we've gained a basic, capacity to think clearly about the sensory world, we're really not ready to venture into the spiritual world. And so in cultivating our thinking, we're doing the safest form of preparation for entry into these spiritual realities that's possible. So he says, within our mind, thought weaves on thought, thought seeks out thought, even when the connections have not been suggested by sensory observation. We make the significant discovery that the world of thought is inherently alive. There is something in me that is developing a living organism of thought. Moreover, I myself am at one with it. So here, he's recapitulating some of what he does in Philosophy of Freedom, of course, and just reminding us that in our thinking, we are already immortal. In our thinking, we are already living in eternal community with spiritual beings. And these spiritual exercises that he's sharing with us are intended to awaken us to the, I say, act/fact of our own thinking, which is, one way of translating Fichte's Tathandlung, which is this insight that Fichte has about the way in which the fact that I exist is in fact my own activity of thinking. And we're doing this while we're still alive in physical bodies, right? We're becoming wide awake to the fact that we are spiritual beings while still incarnated in physical bodies. I think this is a fact that we become aware of when we die in one way or another, and that could be terrifying or it could be awesome, depending on how prepared we are for it, right? But these spiritual exercises are trying to bring us to that awareness before we die. So a few other things I might share here. Steiner reiterates again that while we may not have the clairvoyant sight that allows him to speak about Saturn, Sun, and Moon, and about the deep history of the Earth, he thinks that we can still understand with our wide awake thinking what he is describing to us. And we can still, even if we can't directly read the Akashic record, we can still participate in the stream of thinking. And we must reenact what he shares with us in our own thinking activity, and that we can follow him into the spiritual world initially without this clairvoyant sight. But gradually, through the cultivation of these practices, we are trying to develop spiritual organs of perception, our own spiritual organs of perception, which Steiner describes as lotus flowers, which is a kind of metaphor and an image. He doesn't want us to take it too literally. But when we think of these spiritual organs of perception, they're different from physical organs in the sense that, as he puts it, the very knowing that these organs provide us with is at the same time a blending with the facts that we come to know, right? So these organs of spiritual cognition are enabling a kind of participatory knowledge, right? Where we become one with that which we know. And he then distinguishes between imaginative cognition, and he begins introducing inspiration, cognition through inspiration. And so when we have developed imaginative cognition, we begin to perceive an entirely living world, he says. It's a world of ongoing metamorphosis and transformation. There's no birth and death in this imaginative world, unlike in the physical world, where there is birth and death. He says the imaginative world is a restless place. There's nothing but movement and change, right? So it's all process. And then cognition through inspiration is when we begin to become aware of the spiritual beings that are behind those processes, right? We become aware through inspiration of the inner qualities of the beings that are undergoing the transformation that the imaginative cognition allows us to perceive. And Steiner describes these beings, these spiritual beings they're internally related to one another and he uses the analogy of individual letter sounds to the meaning of a whole word, right? And so when we do gain this cognition through inspiration of spiritual beings, they are individuals, but they're also in these, they're inseparably interrelated with one another. And to really understand them and be able to read the meaning of this world of spiritual beings, we have to be able to perceive those relationships. And so, yeah, in these 20 pages, we don't get into intuition yet. We'll save that for next time. I think that's all that I would like to share to get things going here. So I'll open it up for dialogue now. Karsten, I see your hand.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That was these are very intense pages, and I think you captured that very well in your resume. A lot of food for thought here. But there are two things that I think about. One is Spinoza has this famous distinction between nature as a product and nature as productive. And I think it was Schelling who kind of observed that the same thing applies to our consciousness. That when we look at consciousness, we can also, I guess it goes back to Fichte, but we can both see consciousness as productive, and then there are the products, the actual thoughts and feelings. And so I think when Steiner is talking about this intermediary path where thought is thinking or thinking is thinking itself, I think it's what we need to aim at is actually not understanding thinking as a product, but rather as productive. And this is also, in a sense, inherent in this Tathandlung, the act, fact. So I think this is the very difficult task that we have, not being caught up in this kind of intentional structure that we have in our everyday consciousness, where there's the distinction between the subject and then that which we are thinking about. And so it's, we need to strive for this kind of being with the act, the productive activity, and seeing that, identifying with that, being a part of that, as you were talking about. So that was just one thing that came to mind. And the other thing is when he's talking about imagination and inspiration, that was the next one. I think about these old concepts that go back to Descartes, who talked about clear and distinct ideas, where ideas are clear. This kind of conceptualization was caught up or was picked up by Leibniz first, and later Peirce in his famous paper called "How to Make Our Ideas Clear." And he's talking about, Peirce is talking about interpreting Descartes and Leibniz. He's talking about ideas are clear when we recognize how ideas, the same idea can kind of occur in different contexts. So this is how that's a clear idea. For example, say you might observe that in any kind of experience we have, there's contrasts. So there's something you could call the principle of contrast. And you can, once you've kind of identified this principle, you'll recognize it in any particular experience that you have. So you can have a clear idea of this, say, principle idea, or a clear conception of it. But then also, I think when Stan is talking about inspiration, it's like, then you have to see how this idea is distinct from other ideas, but also connected to them in somehow an organic way. So let's say we could have two other principles, like you might observe that hunger and satiation is a part of any kind of experience you have. So there is also always some process. Any kind of experience is always some kind of digestive process where you have these phases of hunger and satiation. And then there is another principle, like the principle of attraction and repulsion. And it's different from this principle of, it's not exactly the same as hunger and satiation, but there's a connection. So you can, I mean, when you talk about attraction and repulsion, you do not necessarily involve your inner digestive process. It's something you can observe objectively in any kind of phenomena that you see in the world. There's a connection between these ideas. They're both distinct and connected. And so I think moving from imagination to inspiration, it just made me think it has to do with this process of making our ideas more clear and more distinct in the way that Peirce is talking about, and before him Leibniz and Descartes. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Carsten. Just on your first point, like about the act fact, becoming aware of thinking as a productive activity and not getting hung up on the products of thought. This is very difficult, and Steiner has some lectures about our age of the consciousness soul and the amount of anxiety that people are experiencing because of the heightened self-consciousness. And there's a way in which, when you first become conscious of yourself and this thinking activity, it can be a little frightening because you see how much freedom you have. And that can produce anxiety if you're not ready to be at one with that creativity. And so, that's part of the reason I think that Steiner's so emphatic about the importance of seemingly simple exercises to prepare us for this, what is otherwise quite a miraculous transformation that's occurring within us. Because we encounter the double, right? We can get really twisted up unless we're able to push through and on some level feel worthy of this thinking power that we have within us, but on another level not take ourselves too seriously or become conceited about it. And that's where the self-emptying part comes in. But it's not easy when we become self-conscious. There's a lot of anxiety, I think, that can be produced initially. So, yeah. Jeff, please, Jeff K.
Good morning, afternoon, evening. Actually, thanks, Matt. I'm going to pick up on your point of this anxiety of the consciousness soul phase. I basically want to make a short comment. It's really about kind of a current personal insight I've been crystallizing, through these readings, the recent readings, really the book as a whole, but really coming to this chapter. And I apologize, I don't know if he says this in our reading pages for today or just slightly after. My page numbers are different, so I'm always slightly off course. But yeah, the basic insight, and he does say this somewhere, and I don't have the reference in front of me, that this especially in the consciousness soul phase, as you're pointing out, Matt, and really the meaning of the earth as a whole. Sorry, I'm getting a message from Zoom here. What is this saying? Oh, okay, it's nothing. Okay. Yeah, the meaning of the earth, the earth planetary cycle of evolution is it's really this new thing we have called the ego or the I, or the term I like is ontic organization. Ego is kind of problematic, linguistically, and how to parse it out. But yeah, the meaning of the earth and this now we have four bodies now, physical, etheric, astral, and the I. And my crystallization, my insight that's kind of coming forth within me is, and he says something along these lines very, very soon, is this time in our Earth development is a time of really, I forget what language or what word to use, but basically a time of personality, where we are of ego, of personality, of I think of how do we engage, for example, in social media. It's all these little profile pictures, but maybe they're better called personality pictures, because we're all, and where Steiner links that to is when he's using that, whatever term he uses for personality, he directly links that to karma, right? We're here in our personalities, working out our karma, working out our day-to-day relationships with people, and what our thinking, feeling, and willing, and we're all kind of enmeshed in our karma. And we know, of course, from the earlier parts of the book, this karma and reincarnation is a temporary state for humanity, but it's certainly where we're at right now. So yeah, anyways, with all this uh clarity that he's bringing, that yeah, we're in this time of personality, Matt, as you said, the anxiety of the consciousness soul phase, and what he also says, wherever this passage is, I don't have in front of me, that we are, in a sense, we have the opportunity, or the developmental evolutionary possibility of seeing past all of our karma and our personality into this higher spiritual task we each have, right? The objective truth of each of us individuality, the spiritual truth, which we're generally quite blind to. And this, what we could call an objective desire function, or a spiritual task, as Steiner calls it elsewhere. And this, as I say, it opens up such a great insight to me as to the whole book, and beyond, to many things. And, even getting into, things I've talked about in the past, like, for example, the difference between Freud and Reich. It's suddenly, abundantly clear to me. It's like, yeah, Freud was dealing with ego psychology, or personality psychology, karma psychology, whatever we want to call it. And Reich kind of penetrated into this great spiritual psychology, for to coin a term. So anyway, so all this to say, this and many other things are becoming highly crystallized for me as I go through our recent reading. So I'll leave it at that, but certainly more juice to be squeezed from that.
Thanks, Jeff. The other Jeff, please.
Hey guys. Hey everybody. Wow. So this is very intimate, this part of this chapter. And it seems to me that the very first part is kind of a description of what is necessary now, rather than even, I would say, in our time, is necessary in order to negotiate the social circumstances that we are faced with. So, he describes the way in which developing this receptivity allows you to come into terms with that which is working on you from the spiritual world. And we're always being worked on from something like an entity. And in our culture, that is very powerful social influences. And this sets up this sort of matrix where if we're not doing these spiritual exercises, I don't see how we can have a healthy social life. Because if we're not engendering and sort of adducing a relationship with these spiritual beings that are reflecting reality in us through imagination in part, then we're doing it with entities that are impersonal, propagandistic, and are sort of at war to control our psyche. And not only that, but if we're not able to come to terms with integrating our soul life through our willing and our feeling, specifically in this section, then we are contributors to this reactionary environment, because all we have then is reaction without a continuity of authorship with the spiritual world. It seems baseline to me. It probably wasn't in Steiner's time. I mean, there are indications that he foresaw what sort of hot mess we'd find ourselves in, but and then also to in a similar vein, to speak to Karsten's idea of product and production, the productive aspect in the product, seems to be what he's calling for us to do, is to turn that which we produce, the product, into that which is productive again. That we're meant to integrate it. And so you could say, it really hit me, Karsten, when you used feelings as a product. And I think that's accurate. But he's asking us to integrate those feelings into a higher mediated self that allows those to speak to Jeff Kay's, allows those to integrate into a personality that is coherent and cohesive, but coherent to each other. The responsibility, going back to my first part, the first part of my point, which is that it's a responsibility almost to develop these capacities. And I'm also very struck by the explicit, elaborate way he's describing a psycho-spiritual organization that one cannot find anywhere in our contemporary culture, with all its sophisticated years of cognitive science and cognitive research. It's not there. So I just love this conversation, and I'm sorry I have to have missed the last two, but it's this growing intimacy is somehow super key to this work and gives great honor to it, and I'm appreciative of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I just think of this line Steiner says about how life may have given us certain virtues and certain vices, but really what's of value when we begin on the spiritual path and cultivate this spiritual life is the virtues that we ourselves have created. And, you know, so in this new social environment, social media and all this, there's lots of virtue signaling, right? And that's not the creation of one's own virtue. That's conformity to the expectation of the demon-haunted social world, right? And so it's really important that we're able to become creative in our life of in our inner moral life, creative inner moral life, where we're aligning ourselves consciously with certain virtues rather than trying to conform to what we think a certain social group wants of us.
Can I further that based on what you're saying, and then also just looking at what Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney are doing in relationship to trying to formulate something meaningful in the sense that we're talking about here in a similar framework. This idea that we are meant to perceive value because value exists already there. And which means that we're meant to develop the organs to perceive that value because it is a presence that's waiting to talk to us. And yeah, so I just wanted to add that like this dialogue is a crucial social dialogue to be having, and it's a crucial responsibility. So not just as individuals in our individual psychology, but there's something perennial about this work, again, to allude to their new perennialism, what they're going after. There's something perennial about this work, yet absolutely timely. It trips between the two. The psychology is lawful, but also contemporaneous. It's and even more relevant again than I think that when he brought it.
Yeah, just briefly, Max, and then I'll hand it off. I think, there is a bit of a paradox here between creating our own virtues and values and perceiving those values, which are real in a cosmic sense. And I think it's not that there's not a kind of valueception that goes on at the same time that there's a value creation, but there's just so many false socially constructed values going around, which distract us, which deceive us, which cater to the double and not to our own spiritual growth, right?
Yeah, and just one brief, that dog has beautiful teeth, though. There's an impulse in that speaks to a deep desire for our collective humanity right now, I think.
Well said, yeah. Max, please.
Thank you. I was going to try to draw together some of the stocks that people have put out already. And just to pick up on the most recent comment or question about the paradox between discovering values and morals and truth and goodness, and creating it. I think the paradox, I think the dichotomy can be resolved if we have the right analogy or the right concept for it. And I would compare it to something like an artistic creation. If you want to compose a beautiful poem or create a beautiful piece of music, you have to both listen and speak, as it were. And it's like you can propose one solution, and then, but then, life or whatever you call that will either accept it or reject it. And you can feel your way through what is the next note, what is the next melody line. And I feel it's very analogous with the question of whether we are creating values and goodness and virtues from scratch, or whether we're conforming them to some pre-existing pattern. And it seems it's obviously both, and it appears one way when you look at it from a certain side, and another way the other side. But I thought the metaphor of artistic creation can sort of shed light on the question in a more comprehensive way. And I have been thinking about this recently, and it seems clear to me that God actually wants. Well, we have already established, I think, that God doesn't want automatons or machines, really. But he also doesn't, want people that are just completely arbitrary. This kind of Luciferic rebellion. And what he wants is he wants people that can actually carry forward and be continue the ongoing process of creation. There's a term in Genesis that God creates Eve to be Adam's helpmeet, but God creates Adam and Eve to be his helpmeets. And so this is a kind of, but it's, and then, Matt, so Jeff brought up the concept of responsibility, and Matt, you brought up the question of anxiety, and it really strikes me as a kind of creation anxiety. It's like we start out with a given psychology that has, all these more or less arbitrary desires and preferences and prejudices and attitudes, and that's like the canvas on which we have to paint. Or it's maybe a better metaphor is it's as though we're trying to create music, and that's the kind of background track or something. That's the rhythm track. You can't create a beautiful melody on top of a super chaotic rhythm track. You have to first, in a way, like purify so there's a metaphor for the astral body compared to the spirit self. The astral body is like the rhythm, the backing, and you can't have like completely random chaotic backing. You have to have something orderly that then you can build on top of that. And I feel that's kind of the task that we have, is to establish a certain harmony in our psychological life, not so that we can just then kind of put our feet up and rest on our laurels, but rather so we can carry forward this task that, it seems to me that God has in a way delegated to us. And if I read through the Old Testament after the New Testament, it seems as though it's a progressive delegation. Even in chapter 1 in Genesis, God basically just does everything through his word. But already in Genesis 2, Adam is taking an active role. He's naming the animals, for instance. And then it just progresses further with Noah, and so on, all the way to the New Testament. So I'll stop there, but I hope it was able to touch on some of the points that folks have brought up.
Yeah, thanks, Max. No, I think it's clear the Genesis narrative is one, as you're saying, wherein gradually the human being is called upon to complete creation, and God leaves it unfinished. Yeah. Karsten, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Jeff said. I think something very important about this, the product, whether it's a feeling or thought, becoming part of the production. And I think it links to the distinction that Steiner is making between things in the physical world and in the spiritual world, where in the physical world, things seemingly arise out of nothing and seemingly vanishes into nothing. Whereas once you engage with this spiritual perspective, we enter into the business of metamorphosis. So we have this freedom to change, to transform whatever is at hand, and this is the very important work. So we need, our starting point must always be what is there right now, and then we have freedom to play around with that and change it and make it a part of our productive imagination in terms of producing new variations of the same stuff, in a sense.
Yeah, thanks, Karsten. Angus, I think you're next.
Hi all. I've been, whilst everybody's been talking about anxiety, I've been doing my typical nerdy linguist thing, which is whenever there's a word that sort of like feels a little bit like an empty abstract word. I'm not saying you mean it in that sense, but it's one of these things that floats around that doesn't have any physicality to it. And one of the ways of gaining a type of physicality on that is actually looking at the etymology of words. And if you go back to the roots of the word, it's anchor, which in ancient Greek means to throttle or to strangle. And there we've already got an image that we can play with. Sort of like suddenly it's like this nebulous word which we all recognize. It's sort of like somehow becomes a lot more tangible. And then our thinking can begin to play with those images of being throttled or being strangled and relate it to the text that's going on here. So I've got just a few little additions, so like taken out of the inspiration of the word itself, where it can lead us in our thinking, depending on our own, what's the technical term Steiner uses, moral technique in the philosophy of freedom. So this anxiety, one of the places I'm going to look at is the Bhagavad Gita. So when Arjuna's having a hard time on the battlefield, he's got a full-on panic attack there. His problem here, according to Krishna, his doctor, the spiritual doctor, of course, is that he's forgotten his true essence, his true self, his Atma. And if he really realized his own infinite being, then all of the problems that he's faced with, they would take on a completely different aspect. And the rest of the Bhagavad Gita is about unpacking what that actually means to be an infinite being. This is a reference that I've referred to before. Carsten earlier was mentioning Leibniz, and my thinking immediately when Carsten mentions Leibniz and Spinoza, so like two amazing minds of that period of history. And one of my absolute favorite bits of Spinoza is this bit that I'm just about to read out to you, which you might recognize because I've mentioned it before in this group. So this is from Spinoza on the improvement of the understanding, so also intimately linked to the correct use of thinking. And he says, but love towards a thing eternal and infinite feeds the mind wholly with joy, and it is itself unmingled with any sadness, wherefore it is greatly to be desired and sought for with all our strength. Yet it was not at random that I used the words, if I could go to the root of the matter, for, though what I have urged was perfectly clear to my mind, I could not forthwith lay aside all love of riches, sensual enjoyment, and fame. And one of the impressions that I get reading Spinoza there is he's also touched, he's had a conscious experience, which Stein also talks about in this chapter here. It's like an awakening of this eternal aspect that's in us, and this is his way of capturing it. And perhaps it's a good time to remind here, Steiner, not in this book, but I know in other lectures, he talks about reading the lives of saints, reading about the lives of saints. I know this is actually one of the questions that Arjuna asks Krishna. He says, how am I supposed to understand all this type of thing? Give me some people to look at who've been through this process so that I can begin to get my bearings. And one person that's I've had the fortune of coming into contact with, not in real life, obviously, is the work of Santa Teresa of Avila. It's like a saint of 16th century Spain. And if you listen to her, The Interior Castle, and how she's like unpacks this gradual, this path towards the Godhead, this path towards an ever strengthening conscious awareness of the infinite that lives in us, we find this becomes the type of literature that we can find very strengthening in our own process. And then the final person that I'll mention, and this could be a long list, and I'm sure other people could add to this list that I'm making here, but is of course John and I mean, just the whole of John is full of this relation to the infinite, this interpenetration, whereas like God is in me and I am in God. This complete symbiosis of living, expressed in the 7 I am statements, where he says, "I am." What does he say? I am the way and the truth. I am the resurrection. I am the door. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. And so all of these ideas, when we live into them, that throttling that I was talking about before, it disappears. That so like that choking, this movement towards the infinite is something which, this is the way I sense it at least, it automatically performs this releasing action. That which was throttling me is taken away. And then a random, finally, just to wrap up this piece, a random thought that came after I'd been thinking that through was this anchor, the root of anxiety. Of course, we've got the word anchor from ancient Egyptian, the symbol of life. So I did a quick investigation on that. And although etymologically there is no link, the word ankh means the breath of life. And it's almost like there's been a 180 degree inversion of the meaning from ancient Egyptian, into ancient Greece. And we see this happening in philosophy as well, so like realism and idealism. So I just wanted to share those thoughts with you.
Yeah, thanks, Angus, for this etymological grounding. I think with the image of strangling, of a newborn leaving the watery environment of the womb and coming into a subtler substance of air and struggling initially to breathe, right? And then something similar goes on when we first contact the spiritual world. It's a subtler air, and if we're not quite ready to breathe it, we feel suffocated, right? And hence the anxiety. It really opens up this term that we're so used to using, to bring it into that etymological history. And that inversion from the Egyptian is quite, a lot to think about there. Thank you very much. Max, please.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up on what Angus said. So anxiety is probably related to anguish too. And isn't there a word in German like eng that would mean narrow or?
Angst. Angst is like fear.
How do you say narrow in German?
Eng.
Eng.
So yeah, etymologically you can see a link actually there. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, true.
I think what's really illuminating the idea of the reversal, because it makes perfect sense. Like the anxiety emerges before when we're confronted with some so I'm just trying to think, psychoanalyze a little bit why we find ourselves hesitant to undertake this task, and it's I was thinking of something that creates anxiety, and anyone who makes some kind of art also knows what that feels like, but part of the motivation, I think, comes from the fact that the moment we take responsibility for the state of our psychology, we can't just blame it on it. Suddenly it is our responsibility, and that's a daunting prospect because you can't suddenly you don't have recourse to just blame all of your problems on everybody else besides you. And so I think that's like a psychological complex and dynamic that you can observe. But I also think it fits very neatly into the context. Like we actually have this spirit of creativity that's blown into us as the breath of life, but we kind of balk before it and refrain from carrying it into creative action. And so then we have this sort of pent up creative power that what is it going to do but feel narrow and constricted and strangled within the narrow confines of our psychology.
May I?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, please, Jeff.
That's really key. This idea of creation anxiety. The existentialists understood this, like they were potentially Nietzsche and his derivatives. I guess Kierkegaard's not really a derivative, but these people who are authoring this experience, who are trying to put a wedge between the idiocy of modernity and its narrowness, and in the extemporaneous times we live in, and here our answer was postmodernism, which is all of this choking off, right? It's all of this like none of it is anything that's valuable or workable. And what Steiner's doing is giving us the tools to work with something, to turn it into something valuable, whether it's shit or not, right? Whether it's product or not, whether it's waste or not, it becomes something that is compostable and resurrectable. And this is, to me, this is really important because you mentioned this, the inversion of the constraint, right? And there's that idea of eye of the needle, right? But what is it that's passing through the eye of the needle, right? We're called not to pass through the eye of the needle, but to become that which passes through the eye of the needle, right? So this is also key then, I think, with what Karsten was saying, even more so than I think he or I even meant by it, which is this idea that the sensible and the super sensible are somehow separate. Isn't this what we're working on? Like when I see the world as a sense perceptible reality, there's super sensible reality processually going on right there. And what we're working on is being able to perceive that which is right in front of us all the time, right before us all the time. And so this idea of adduction and receptivity and to me, it also speaks to the idea, blows apart the idea of what memory is as something of the past, but remembering that which we forecast into the future and find right in relationship now.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Is your hand still up from before, Max? Or okay. Well, while I have a minute, I want to remind you all that you're all welcome to introduce any of these sessions. Just shoot us an email and let me know if you'd like to do so. And also, Angus and Rosemary are going to be doing a pop-up for us on Steiner's lecture on the work of the angels in the astral body. And we're zeroing in on a date, so stay tuned for that, coming up in the next several weeks. And the invitation for a pop-up unrelated to occult science, or, I mean, everything's going to be related on some level, but that invitation is also open, just as a reminder. Rosemary, please.
Well, I wanted to remember back in 2003, when I was in Foundation Studies of Anthroposophy, introduced to the 6 basic exercises. And we called the 5th one non-judgmentalness. So, and also the positivity with the story about the beautiful teeth of the dead dog. I just wanted to share that, I was already in my 50s, and it was such a liberating opening that Steiner gave. It's like we have the seeds of that within us if we study philosophy or literature or anything with spiritual truth in it, but somehow I was in the time and place where I could really take it up, and it's been seriously, constantly healing and nourishing ever since then. Especially positivity. I remember saying in class, I never thought I would understand how a world war could be a positive thing. But
Thanks, Rosemary. Max, and then Angus.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on Rosemary's point about, I think she was alluding to this, like the recognition of a certain power we have in respect to what we look for and how we look at things. And, the naive attitude is that what we see, everything we see just kind of climbs into our eyes or something. But as we do this work, then it becomes, as we saw studying philosophy of freedom, becomes like just a datum of experience that everything that you see is conditioned by how you were looking for it. And so then, and once again, though, I think the soul tends to balk at that prospect because suddenly you have to take responsibility for all of your experience, and you can't just kind of blame everything on your surroundings.
Yeah. Thanks, Max. Angus, please.
Yeah, I wanted to share a final discovery. This is actually a point that I developed last week about the will, but it came to me in a surprising way. Rosemary and I we're preparing to give this talk, but I've been looking at the lecture series around that time as well, because it's an immensely period. It's like 1917, immensely interesting period in what Steiner produces there. And particularly in 179, which is, I'm not sure the title at the moment, Necessity and Free Will, something like that. It's 179 anyway. But in one of the lectures there, he says in a very clear and almost abrupt way, the essence of the I is the will. And when we begin to think about how it is the activation of the will that is always essential in all of these exercises, whether we're fighting against time when we're doing the backward review, or whether we're placing specific content in our mind, it's the will that's doing it, or whether we're forcing ourselves to not be led by the body and social habits to criticize something, but actually to find something of value. All of these exercises that's happening in this conscious sphere, but intimately at the same time related to this will aspect of us. So when Steiner says in this chapter, he talks about one of the differences in this type of work is, or why you can say there's no guru involved, is because if you ask for an explanation of why these particular exercises are valid, you will also receive that. You don't do anything on blind faith. There is also an explanation. But the essence of the I is the will was something particularly potent for me this week in relation to this chapter. So.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. And I'm reminded of something I didn't mention during my summary, which is the importance of patience when we're doing these exercises, that clairvoyance isn't going to happen tomorrow because you started working really hard today. And that, part of the moral baseline that would be required to develop spiritual sight includes patience and includes an approach to these exercises as ends in themselves, right? They're their own good. You're not looking for something else. You're doing the exercises as intrinsically valuable. And that's an important reminder because, there's a part of us that wants to see what Steiner is reporting. And it might be that we don't get to see that until our next lifetime, or so patience, patience. Yeah. Any final comments?
Forgive me, I haven't been putting my hand down, but I'm just going to jump. The way you're saying that, here's what I think is happening. You recognize that they're healthy and salubrious exercises. Like, we need these things. But you also recognize that the only way that they will bear fruit is if you're not casting yourself ahead of yourself. And so doing them for their own sake and doing them as their own ends is kind of a means to actually make the kind of progress that we're really looking for. You have to have the right frame of mind for it.
Yeah, thanks, Max. All right, everyone. Really a privilege and an honor to do this work with you all.
Thank you, Matt.
And look forward to next week. See you next Tuesday.